Okay. Hello, my name is Spencer Yolberg. Uh, this is my week 7 project presentation for IT infrastructure. Um, to start off, I wanted to talk about fonts that was covered in Chapter 7, just really quickly here. Fonts are defined in the book as a collection of characters of similar style and appearance. Now, when deciding what font you want to use aside from size, you have to ask yourself, how do you want it to look? Uh, do you want it to look feminine? Do you want it to look masculine, formal or informal, cartoony or classy? So on. Um, Fonts can vary from a very straightforward text like Times New Roman to really crazy ones like Chiller or Wingdings or Jokerman. You can even get custom fonts from the internet, such as this one. This is a Diablo font that I got for a project I was working on in Photoshop that I downloaded from the internet. It was created using CSS, and it's a font based entirely on the title of this game as well as the text in game. It's a PC game, and it's obviously called Diablo. Right. So that's all well and good, but let's get to the implementation of fonts and how it can make a difference to your company, especially if your company is printing a lot. So for a real life example, I wanted to talk about a 14-year-old kid who came up with a solution that could potentially save the government millions of dollars just by changing the default font that was used when printing. For what basically started as like a 6th grade science fair project, Suvir, he tested 4 different fonts: Garamond, Times New Roman, Century Gothic, and Comic Sans. He printed out the most commonly used letters, which you can imagine were vowels and whatnot, and measured using a tool how much ink was used for each letter for each font. And he figured out by using Garamond, which has thinner strokes and a finer point, his school district could reduce its ink consumption by 24%, and in turn save as much as $21,000 annually. Once he figured this out, it kind of led him to expand his view and look at a bigger picture, like the federal government, which they spend somewhere on average around $1.8 billion per year in printing. So running those same tests again, but using the printing materials that he was able to obtain from a government website and switching the font to Garamond, he found that they could save 30% or $136 million per year by switching to this font. So the company you work for may not be part of the federal government or print as much, but in the end, it's the small implemented changes that could wind up saving the company that you work for a lot of money on printing resources. So moving forward, I wanted to talk about programming as it was discussed in Chapter 10. As it's defined, a programming language is used to instruct a computer to perform a task. Okay? So Steve Jobs once said, everybody in this country should learn how to program a computer because it teaches you how to think. Now, despite your feelings for Steve Jobs, if he was even a coder, if he stole everything from Steve Wozniak, he's not wrong with this quote. I do truly believe that our education system should start offering programming classes or lessons from a fairly early age. So there are already a ton of resources online so that anyone with any interest could easily learn to code. Granted, looking at all that information, I do understand can be a bit overwhelming, so I do understand that. That's why I would suggest that they use a program called Scratch to start teaching kids early in schools. Um, Scratch is a project of the Lifelong Kindergarten Group at the MIT Media Lab, and yeah, so it's very easy to use, and it is completely free, and anyone can get it. And the skills you learn through using Scratch could easily be transferred to Python and Java, which are two very common third generation languages, as we learned from our book. So, and don't get me wrong, you don't need to dedicate your career to programming to add programming to your career. For an example here, Excel lets you create simple macros that allow, that help you in working with spreadsheets and creating spreadsheets. And, there are products like a lot of Adobe products like Photoshop, Illustrator, After Effects, and more that can be automated using JavaScript programming. And I would bet you a lot of money there's probably some application that you use daily that if you learn to program, it could help you work better and faster. Okay. So, if you do start learning a language, I'd recommend something like Python, JavaScript, Ruby, Java, and you could very well be making your life easier. And I personally think programming is like the world's best logic puzzle, and it's just sort of fun to learn. So that said, just get out there and start saying hello world. Passwords. In chapter 14, the book went lightly into some of this, but I wanted to dive a little deeper into password security and some stuff along those lines. So, the most common passwords that are used are what might be what you expect, but they're as follows. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, password, QWERTY, which is basically just home row, but above it, typed in a row. Football, let me in, I love you, login, ABC 1, 2, 3, sunshine, and so on. And there are other variations of this, like longer letter or longer number chains, or replacing a 0 for an O in a word. And all around, it's just not very clever. There are places online that allow you to check how secure your password is and how long it might take to crack. For the examples I got here, I've used a website, and first of all, don't actually enter your personal passwords, but I do highly recommend messing around and seeing how variables can change the outcome. Or your something you might use as a password, but obviously not your actual password. For these examples, the most common, they can be cracked in like milliseconds, but no time at all. So let's move forward. Let's look at an example of the password, which is Beehive. So Beehive is just a little fun word, and that's the website I use there. Beehive can be cracked in 43.4 seconds because it is in a password library, which I will get into momentarily here. But as you can see on the next line, Beehive 35, just adding the 35 to the end of it, increases the time it takes to crack the password by 5 days. Adding an @ sign to the end of that makes it 2 months. And then adding an asterisk takes 12 years. And so on and so forth. Basically, the complexity, you can see how little things just increase that time that it would otherwise take to crack the password. So, my friend recently sent this to me, sent me this website labeled as the world's most secure password, which should be in quotes, because, obviously you look at it and you think, well, that's got to be a very secure password, but the joke being that the password never changes. You could go to that website right now, and you would be given this exact same password. And obviously, because it's out there as one of the world's most secure passwords, it's actually not the most secure. And aside from the obvious, you might be asking why. And that is because of password libraries. Password libraries are basically some variant of a text document that has thousands upon thousands of the world's most common passwords. So there are many variations of them that you can get, such as language, first names that are like the most common first names in a certain year, sports team names, so on and so forth. And these are very, very easy to find, these libraries. And it's used it's called brute force style, which is basically passwords are simply tried over and over and over again by a script and basically slammed in there until it can get a correct variant or the correct password in. So if you think of your PC or network as a nightclub, your password is essentially the bouncer at the door. You want to have the biggest, baddest looking dude you can find so that people don't try to mess with the place, and even if they tried, they'd never have a chance. This dude's big. He's just going to put his hand on their chest and push them away. Never going to get it. So what can you do to implement safer password controls? First, don't use personal information. Don't use your birth date or your address to your home. Anything that's personal to you. In this day and age, it's very easy to find out a lot about a person without ever meeting them, and this information is easily obtainable, sometimes from a simple Google search. I assume we all have Facebook, and we give that information voluntarily, date of birth, stuff like that. There are steps to hide this information from people you don't want to see it, but it's still technically out there, and so that is something to keep in mind. So for the second one, force password changes regularly. You want to make sure that in the system there's scheduled password changes very frequently. And, the more frequent you change the passwords, the better off you are. Obviously, to a certain degree, you don't need to be changing it every day. But I could see some places doing once a week or even, once every month. And that wouldn't be a bad idea. Third, you don't want to allow repeats, and you don't want to repeat. So you want to make sure that passwords aren't repeated or small things aren't just changed. So like when changing your password, you want to make sure that the password that you once used, you don't want to use something similar because it could be compromised. And the idea of changing your password is to increase security or maintain that high level that you already have. So you don't want to use, for example, like bear hair with an exclamation point at the end, then simply change it to bear hair with 2 exclamation points. If someone were to get access to your previous passwords, it doesn't increase the complexity to add the same character running multiple times. So you want to make sure that you don't do that. Okay. Fourth would be require complexity, which is like we talked about before, with simply adding some numbers and a few symbols. It can drastically change the duration of time it takes significantly to crack the password. And it's also worth adding that new passwords should probably be run against at least one of the most basic libraries of common passwords. And if it does match, then it can't be used. And the same should go for personal information. If someone, you don't want it to be like your last name or your first name, it's just not good. So running against libraries to make sure it's complex enough is the bottom line there. So for the fifth, we have account lockout, which is if someone's trying to log in as you through any platform and they're trying to guess the password, assuming they don't have it or they aren't extremely lucky, and you didn't use one of the silly passwords that we talked about, they were the super common ones, such as password. Your system should implement an account lockout where after multiple failed attempts, the system locks the account from being accessed for a period of time. So the duration of this is sort of up to you, but I would generally recommend at least 15 to 30 minutes as a minimum, if maybe not an hour, because it's enough of a pain in the butt that whoever's trying it probably isn't going to wait around for 30 minutes in between tries. But it is a low enough time that if you do it on accident, you can kind of hang out and wait for that logout to expire so that you can log in again. And depending on the situation you're in, if you're the network administrator or you're on the user end, you could always just contact them, or they would contact you and tell you, I forgot my password, and they'll usually help you get situated. And just to reiterate, all these things that I mentioned here, they're not only for password security for like businesses. This is something that is built into the default Windows, and I'm sure Mac has its own variant that you could put into effect on your personal computer if you so chose. And by doing so, you'd just be that much more secure. Okay. All right. I just wanted to thank you for your time to watch my presentation, and I hope that you learned something, or you at least found it interesting, and have a great day.